Hi everybody, and thank you again for watching another episode of Gaffer in Gear. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Amaran 150c and its big brother, the Amaran 300c. These are full color gamut RGBWW COB lights. Now these lights are missing a few professional features such as DMX, which means they're not going to be everybody's cup of tea. But for fully calibrated, full color gamut RGBWW lights that cost under $500 US, these things are definitely worth having a look at. So let's talk about the capability of these lights and the price point to start off with. So the 300 watt unit here sells for $455 US, and the 150 watt unit here sells for $305 US. So very cost effective lights. Now, in terms of operating modes, you've only got the two modes. You've got your CCT mode or white light mode, and you've got your HSI or color mode. If you want special effects or anything like that, you have to do that through the Sidus Link phone app. Now, in terms of the control structure, it's on the head of the light. So that's something important to note. It's not on a controller like with other aperture lights. So if you've got this high up in the air and you want to make an adjustment manually, you're going to have to lower it down. Now let's go through the capabilities of the lights. So in the CCT mode, we've got a CCT range from 2500 Kelvin up to 7,500 Kelvin. The lights also have green magenta capability. Now in terms of the green magenta capability, that is adjustable in 10% increments only. So you can't do real fine-tune adjustment with it. In terms of the CCT adjustment, that's adjustable in 100 Kelvin increments. Now, in terms of using the user interface, it is really straightforward to use. The one knob here adjusts your intensity or brightness. And if you press that knob, it'll toggle between the two operating modes. The other knob here adjusts your parameters. So we're in the CCT mode, we can adjust our CCT or our Kelvin, and we can then press the button to select the next parameter, which is green and magenta adjustment. Now let's go and have a look at our HSI mode. So I'll press the button on this side to go over to our HSI mode. We've got the full 360 colors of adjustment that we can select. And if I press the button again, we can desaturate, and we can desaturate in 1% increments. Now here's the thing to note, this will only desaturate to 6,500 Kelvin, and that's on the Planckian curve. So you can't select the Y point at which you desaturate to. Now in terms of the back of the unit here, there's only one more button, and that's the Bluetooth reset for phone app operation. Now these lights do have a bow and mount, which gives you a huge amount of softbox accessory options. Now the lock-off system gives a good secure hold, and it could easily take the weight of a 3-foot dome. But it is claimed that you can put the Dome 150 on this. Now I think that's pushing the limitations of the locker. And with the grid on the front, this can slip really easily. All right, so let's go through the cons that I haven't mentioned yet. So a big con for professional users, there is absolutely no DMX capability. Now the next con, if you're a rental house for example, there is no USB port for firmware updates. You have to update the firmware via the phone app only. So if you've got a lot of these, that's going to take a fair bit of time. The next con for professional users, there is no weather protection on this, so you can't use it outside in the rain. Well, technically you can use it outside in the rain, just don't expect it to work well on the next job. The next negative for me is there is no direct battery mount options. So for example, you can't just slam a couple of E-mount batteries on this and take it outside. However, it does have a 48 volt regulated inlet, so a possible solution to this would be the aperture power station. The next possible negative is the position of the light mixing surface. Now this is positioned far enough away from the LED emitters that you do get one single light source. So if you're blending through your colors, there's no patching. It's one beautiful light color. Now here's the negative. It is positioned a little bit more forwards from the bow and mount than most lights. So some of your hard light modifiers from third-party suppliers might not fit onto this light like you're hoping. In addition to that, even the supplied reflectors don't match up perfectly. From the position of the mount, the neck of the COB sticks out further than the neck of the dish. This results in a large area of the reflector not being illuminated, which reduces the efficiency. So with the supplied reflector attached, you get a little bit over double the amount of light level, whereas I would expect a good COB and dish combination to give me 3, possibly 4 times the amount of light. Now the next negative is a temporary one, and that is this light tracks to the Planckian curve, with the exception of 3400 to 4500 Kelvin, where this thing seems to skew towards magenta. Now it didn't do that when I originally took it out of the box. It only seems to be something that's happened since the last firmware update. So I put that down to an algorithm glitch, which hopefully they'll fix soon. All right, let's go through the pros that I haven't mentioned yet. Now, as you'd expect for the price, the bulk of the body is made of plastic, but the parts that are essential, such as the Bowen mount and the stand mount, are made from a very solid metal, so they're definitely going to last. The next pro for me is this thing is incredibly easy to use. Now that's a pro from a rentals perspective. I've got a lot of clients who rent lights off me who don't know anything about lighting. They're just influencers or doing low budget corporate videos. You can't get a more simple light to operate than this. The next pro is the color render. You can have a look at all that detail later on in the video. The color render on this light is superb. The next one is an important pro if you're doing interviews. The cooling fans are quiet. So I've got both lights running next to me here with the cooling fans operating, and you can't hear them on my microphone. The next pro for me is these lights retain their last settings. So let's say you're using them in a studio environment, you turn the power off, come back the next morning and turn the power back on, they will go back to their previous settings. So even though they don't have DMX, this is a pro. One of the big pros for me is the weight. The 300C here with its entire kit only comes in at a little bit over 5 kilograms. And the last pro is definitely the price point. Speaking of price point, let's have a look at what you get. All right, so the 150 here sells for $305 US. I've seen it advertised for 550 Australian dollars, and the 300 here sells for 455 US dollars, and I've seen it advertised at 710 Australian dollars. All right, now both kits are pretty much identical, so let's put the 150 down and just concentrate on the 300. Now, in terms of how identical they are, even the lights themselves have the same housings. All right, so they come in the styrofoam boxes. So the styrofoam boxes have a handle at the top and they have a lid that locks into place. Now, the thing that's going to fail on these in terms of longevity is the hinge here. That's definitely going to be the point at which they're going to fail first. So I can see a lot of people in the future having these with gaffer tape on the back. But look, for the price that they're selling at, I think it's fair enough that they don't come with a more sturdy bag. But in all honesty, this has been on quite a few jobs already, and I have to say, and it's a bit of a backhanded compliment, that this case is holding together better than the bags did for my 1200Ds. All right, so let's go through what you get here. You get a standard hyper reflector. You get the light itself. You also get a protective cover for the COB area. You get your regional power cable. Now the regional power cable is quite short, and I think that's to do with the fact there isn't a lot of space in here. And packed securely underneath some foam here is the power supply, which is 48 volts DC out. Okay, let's take a look at how the Amaran 150c performs with no modifier attached. Now the beam spread isn't as wide or even as you'd get off a monocolor or a bicolor COB, but it's pretty much on a par with all other full color gamut COBs. There's no obvious color aberration or fringing towards the edge of the beam. You would really have no problem lighting up a large modifier or a large area. And the results are the same regardless of the CCT or color that you dial in. As I would expect from a light with a very small COB area, the shadows are very sharp. Now let's take a look at the 150C with its supplied reflector. And this does have a little bit of a hot spot in the center of the beam. It's not really all that noticeable unless you're looking for it. The colour seems very consistent from one edge of the beam to the other, regardless of what CCT or colour you have dialed in. But just like with most faceted reflectors, it has some very noticeable double shadowing. Now let's take a look at the 300C with no modifier attached. And it's pretty much the same as the 150. It has a large beam spread that could easily light up a large modifier, but if you're using it as a raw light source, it's not as even as it would be if it was a monocolor or a bicolor light. This has a larger COB, so the shadows are not quite as crisp as with the 150, but they are still very sharp. Now let's take a look at the 300C with the supplied reflector. As far as faceted reflector dishes go, this is pretty good. It's got a reasonably even beam, and it has a bit of a hot spot, but it's not really noticeable. There's no noticeable colour fraying towards the edge of the beam, and the results are consistent regardless of the CCT or colour that you dial in. In terms of the shadows, they're what I would expect from a faceted dish. Now the next thing I wanted to test was a hard light modifier to see if this diffusion surface here gives us one clean light source. Now Aperture do have a lot of hard light modifiers that can fit this. I just don't happen to have any of them. Now the only hard light modifier I could find that fitted this was the Nanlite Fresnel. So let's have a look. Okay, let's have a look at the Nanlite FL20G Fresnel mounted to the Amaran 150c. And as you can see, it's not the tightest fit in the mount. The Fresnel does sag forward a little bit. Now it's got a beautiful wide even spread like I would expect off any Fresnel, and the beam looks more than even enough to please me. The results seem to be the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in, and regardless of the colour. Barn door cuts are extremely good regardless of colour and regardless of CCT dialed in. And it spots up very impressively. And this combination has the shadow qualities that I'd expect from a good old school Fresnel. Now let's try the same Fresnel on the 300C. And in terms of a flood, it's pretty much identical to the 150. It's a nice wide spread with a gentle drop off and a very even beam, regardless of CCT and colour. Barn door cuts are definitely not as sharp, and they do have some additional convexing. It spots up impressively, it definitely has good shadows, but they're not as sharp as this Fresnel in combination with the 150. All right, let's start going through all the data I've collected. So this data is collected off the 300 with its dish attached because it seems to be calibrated to work best with the dish. Let's start off with the dimming characteristics. According to my frequency meter, this light is running pulse width modulation at 25,102 Hz. This seems to be regardless of what the dimmer is set to. Now let's take a look at the dimming characteristics at 3200 Kelvin. I've taken readings at 100%, 50%, 25%, 10% and 5%. The CCT is extremely constant. In fact, the maximum difference was 20 Kelvin. Below 25%, there is a small drop in the color render, and the delta UV or white point is extremely consistent. Now let's take a look at the results at 5600 Kelvin. Again, the CCT is incredibly consistent. The color render is a consistent TM30RF of 93. And again, the white point accuracy or delta UV only shifts plus or minus 0.0007 maximum, which again would be completely unnoticeable unless you had a color spectrometer. Now let's take a look at the average CCT accuracies. Between 2500 to 3000 Kelvin, the light is typically out by 46. Between 3100 to 4000 Kelvin, the light is out by an average of 74. Between 4100 to 5000 Kelvin, the light is off the target by an average of plus 229. And from 5100 Kelvin to 6000 Kelvin, the light is typically out by 218 Kelvin. Now let's take a look at color render measured in TM30RF. Between 2500 to 3500 Kelvin, it comes in with a 95. Between 3600 to 5300 Kelvin, it comes in with a 94. And from 5400 Kelvin to 5900 Kelvin, it comes in with a 93. Now let's take a look at our white point placement or delta UV. Now this light tracks to the Planckian curve, with one exception between 3400 to 4500 Kelvin, where it seems to track under towards magenta for some reason. And this is why I've split the results up a bit differently to how I normally split them. All right, let's take a closer look at some of the CCTs now, starting off with the lowest Kelvin that we can dial in. When I dialed in 2500 Kelvin, I got 2557. The TM30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 100% color saturation. All of the CRI scores are plus 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point was very accurate with a delta UV of plus 0.0003. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3259 with an SSI score of 85. The TM30 color render results were 95% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point was very accurate with a delta UV of minus 0.0005. When I dialed in 4400 Kelvin, I got 4587. The TM30 color render results were 94% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And at this point, the light is quite magenta with a delta UV of minus 0.0018. That's still under, but very close to a 1/8 correction gel. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5780 with an SSI score of 74. The TM30 color render results were 93% average color accuracy with an average 101% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the light is tracking very accurately to the Planckian curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0001. However, if your camera is working to the daylight curve, that would make this light slightly magenta to a little bit more than the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel if you haven't dialed any correction into the light. Now I've also taken readings at 6000, 6500 and 7000 Kelvin. When I dialed in the top CCT of 7500, I got 7561 Kelvin. The TM30 color render results were 91% average color accuracy with an average 99% color saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 is below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point is still tracking very close to the Planckian curve with a delta UV of plus 0.0005. Now let's take a look at how accurately this light can dial in its color hues. Red, which is 0 degrees or 360 degrees, came in at 1 degree. But interestingly enough, have a look at this spectrum. This is quite chunky for a red color emitter. When I dialed in 120 degrees or green, I got 117. And this is possibly off because of the little bit of red that is still being emitted. When I dialed in 240 degrees or blue, I got 241. When I dialed in 60 degrees or yellow, I got 67 degrees. But it does look a little bit green. I would recommend dialing in 43 degrees if you want a decent looking yellow. When I dialed in 180 degrees or cyan, I got 183. And magenta, which should be 300 degrees, came in at 258. Well, that's another gear review done. And again, thank you for your company. Now, my closing thoughts on these lights. In terms of these being part of my personal kit that I'd carry around in my lighting vans, it's a big no from me because they don't have any DMX capability. In terms of a situation where I buy these, if I had a job that ran for maybe a couple of weeks and I had to put some colored light in a background and I didn't have to do any DMX queuing, then I would definitely consider these because they are cheaper to buy than it would be to rent anything else. And at the end of the shoot, possibly I'd be able to sell them. From a rentals perspective, this one has been a bit of a success because it's simple to use. But I don't know in terms of long term if this would be a good investment for a rental company. And here's why. Why would you rent them when they are so cheap to buy? So that could work against you. But look, if you don't need DMX, if you're someone who lives in the Sidus app universe, these lights are probably a bit of a no-brainer to buy. I'm Andrew Locke. See you on the next episode of Gaffer and Gear.